Hello, viewers. My name's Patrick Lawrence. I'm one of the co-editors of the Scrum, and I'm very pleased this morning to welcome Adam Weinstein onto our programs. Uh, Adam is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute uh, with a focus on Pakistan and Afghanistan. Uh, he's a former Marine with a tour in Afghanistan notched on his holster. So he knows whereof he speaks as we converse this morning. Adams just published a very notable paper called Beyond May 1, The Future of US Engagement in Afghanistan. Transparency, I was one of the editors of Adams' paper. And the appeal, the force and appeal of his argument is a big reason why we're on camera this morning. I want to talk to him. He published that just before the not so long before the May 1 announcement of the Biden administration's withdrawal plans. I'm told by Quincy colleagues that there's reason to think that some of Biden's language derived from Adams' paper. Nothing like flattery, right? I rank that a category above our president's earlier borrowings from Neil Kinnock. We'll put that in the past. So I wanted to bring this paper to your attention, and I just can't wait to sort of, as we say, download Adam on his thoughts now that we have a new situation. Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Really delighted to be talking to you. I think maybe the most logical place to start is to ask you for a summary of your argument. We have this in brackets now because Adam presented an argument for the May 1 deadline, and the May 1 deadline is not going to be met, but it's not going to miss by much. So, Adam, please tell us the core features of your argument.
Well, we always advocated for the May 1 deadline for a couple of reasons. One was that it would keep the US Taliban agreement alive. Two is that it'd guarantee that the Taliban wouldn't re-engage US troops. And then lastly, we thought that it was important that if there was an extension, it should have a firm date, which is the path that President Biden has chosen. If your guests don't want to read the 30-page brief, which you made much more readable with your edits, so thank you very much for that. But if they don't want to read the full brief, the main arguments are this. A US troop presence in Afghanistan cannot solve the conflict, which is 40 years in the making, because US troops are simultaneously a guarantor of security for the Afghan government, but a driver of the conflict otherwise. And you can't decouple those two roles. And so folks who want to keep the US troops on the ground now will argue that well, they're a guarantor of the Afghan government's security. They provide leverage in the negotiations. But this is a bit of a catch-22, and the logic is a bit circular, because while it's true that there might be some leverage in the short term, unless the Taliban truly believe that the United States will remain militarily involved in Afghanistan indefinitely, and by indefinitely, I don't mean 2 years or 4 years, I mean decades. Yeah. That leverage is not worth that much because they have more staying power. Another argument folks who want to keep US troops on the ground will make is, well, there's other regional actors that have their thumb on the scale and sort of artificially change, or from the outside, they change power dynamics in Afghanistan. And these countries include Pakistan. But even countries like Pakistan have more staying power in the region than the United States does. And then what this paper really argues against, and I think this is the most unique argument in it, is that we shouldn't transition from a policy of using US troops to militarily defeat the Taliban to another flawed policy of using US troops to try to coerce a peace agreement between two warring parties. And if you see, that's the transition that's happened. A few years ago, the foreign policy establishment was arguing that, let's step back for a second and look at the evolution of the arguments. For the first 15 years of the conflict, the argument was keep US troops on the ground so US troops can militarily defeat the Taliban. And then for several years after that, from maybe 2012 to 2017, I mean, give or take a year or two, I think the argument transitioned to let's keep US troops on the ground until the Afghan military can defeat the Taliban militarily. And now everybody's decided those two things aren't really possible. So we should transition to keep US troops on the ground so that we can coerce a peace agreement. But the common denominator in all of those arguments is using US troops. And the paper argues that that simply would not work.
Yeah, it's sort of an intellectual shell game, right? One grows very tired of it. Tell me, you didn't get your May 1 date, but we've got September 11th. What's your thought on what we've just been told?
Well, I think it was a real, when you listen to President Biden's speech, it was a real indictment of what's sometimes referred to as the blob or the foreign policy establishment's affection for forever wars. He really disarmed their arguments. I mean, he's not looking at this with rose-colored glasses, and neither were we in our analysis. There is still terrorism threat in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda's not defeated, it's degraded, but it doesn't warrant this indefinite deployment of US troops. Afghans are going to suffer as a result of this withdrawal, but staying would not have changed that net outcome of violence. And a peace agreement is something that the United States should pursue, but it should pursue through diplomacy and sustainable community-focused development, not through using US troops as leverage, or the word I might use, actually holding US troops hostage to the outcome of an uncertain diplomatic process. And in fact, if your listeners read the brief, there's an entire section that cites numerous political science studies and historical studies of past peace agreements that demonstrates that even if they had gotten a peace agreement down on paper, the likelihood it would be implemented was extremely low, especially if US troops remained in the country. So I applaud the Biden administration for its decision to set a firm date. I think it was a mistake to back itself into a logistical corner and not be able to leave by May 1st. I do understand why President Biden was inclined to go for this sort of Hail Mary option of trying to get a peace deal before he left. When he saw it wasn't happening, he set a firm date for withdrawal, and I think that's good. But what's going to be important is not allowing the summer violence that will inevitably occur to draw US troops back into the conflict. He needs to remember why he made this decision and stick to it even when things get rough, because summer is long in Afghanistan and it's traditionally the fighting season and it's a very violent time. And I think there are going to be very strong calls for him to reverse his decision, and he's going to have to resist those calls.
Yeah. I thought that was one of the excellent parts of your paper, where you picked apart with statistics and studies and so forth, the percentage of peace agreements that do not hold when they are imposed by external powers. And, as you've just gone over, good. September 11th, some people are reading some significance into this date. It's the end of the forever wars and so on. Is this, in your view, does this mark a secular turn in US foreign policy? And that's a wider question, right? In other words, what's the best way to read this in a wider context?
Well, it marks the first time a president has, regardless of choosing September 11th as the date or not, it marks the first time that, in the last 20 years that a US president has really, questioned the very premise of forever wars. Because if you look at past calls for withdrawal, it was always in this sort of mission complete sense of the word.
Yeah.
You know, and President Biden somewhat rejected that. He rejected the mission creep. This is not a time for celebration. This is a time for reflection. And that was the tone of his speech. And that's my personal feeling about the end of the war. We did not militarily win the war in Afghanistan, full stop. And I think it's very difficult for the military establishment and foreign policy community to grapple with that. And if you look at the individuals who so often speak for the military establishment, who had leadership roles in these forever wars that began in 2001, most of them were field grade officers or even generals at the time these conflicts began. So they saw the conflicts at a different vantage point. They didn't necessarily witness the dysfunction that the rank and file of the US military saw. And it was their war. They were responsible for it. And I think that failure is very difficult for the military to accept and very difficult for the foreign policy establishment to accept. This should mark a turn in the way US foreign policy is thought about. Unfortunately, what you see in Washington, D.C. is people will argue against, broad authorizations for use of military force. They'll say we should apply the lessons of Afghanistan going forward. You know, if you look a few years ago, there were a lot of calls. I look back a few years ago, there were a lot of calls for ending the war in Afghanistan. But as soon as the end came in sight and you could see the light at the end of the tunnel, people went silent. And there were very few voices. I mean, Quincy Institute was one of those voices, but there were very few voices in the last few months that were really imploring President Biden to withdraw by May 1.
Yeah, right.
Because it became too real. I mean, I think the American public supported it, but there were very few voices as part of the policy debate that were advocating for this, because it was a difficult, lonely position, because they did not want to engage. The foreign policy community did not want to engage with the reality of the situation, which is that there was going to be a dismal amount of violence no matter what. And I think people became too comfortable, just directing blame at everyone. Well, we can criticize Pakistan, we can criticize US military strategy, we can criticize COIN or counterinsurgency methods, we can criticize the Afghan government and their corruption. And it became a very comfortable perch from which to watch the conflict, where you criticize everyone, but you don't take a stand at all. And I think we need a more brave foreign policy that accepts the limits of US force, accepts that there will be immense human suffering without US intervention, but there will be with US intervention, and not retreat into these corners where you get to take the moral high ground, but you don't actually have to have a plausible plan.
I take it, Adam, you're accepting of a certain amount of turmoil, and that might be too mild a term, after the US withdraws, casting this as one way or another simply inevitable. I think listeners would like to get good clarity on that. I certainly would.
Well, this was something that kept me up at night sometimes. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I served in Uruzgan province. It was in the southwest. It's a place with a lot of Taliban activity. In fact, one of the first battles of the war in Afghanistan was fought in Tarin Kot. I think there's a certain privilege that I always recognize, which is that I get to sit in New York and say, well, the United States should withdraw its troops and there will be a surge in violence, but that's a consequence we have to accept. And I think it's important to accept, the privilege I have in being able to say that and in not affecting my life. And I do believe that in the long term, there's a benefit to Afghanistan from a US withdrawal now. But that's of little comfort to Afghans in the short term who experience that violence. You can't quite go to Afghans and say, well, don't worry, net violence will probably be lower if you measure it 20 years from now, even though it's going to surge right now. That being said, that's not how US policy should be formulated. US policy has to be based in realistic assessments. And this is what I go back to. This is what I mean when I talk about the sort of moral hypocrisy of the debate in Washington, where people pat themselves on the shoulder for saying, well, we're going to stay involved in Afghanistan because it's about Afghan human rights. But that's not what it's about. That's not what it's really about for them. And they're not pursuing an achievable objective. So I think it's important to say honestly, look, violence is going to surge in Afghanistan because the US withdrawal will change, quickly change the power dynamics in the country. That's a fact.
Yes.
But unless somebody is willing to honestly say we should remain militarily involved in Afghanistan indefinitely, measured by decades, then I don't see an alternative. And frankly, that indefinite presence in the country would slowly bleed the country, and you would see a higher rate of net violence, I think. And some of the literature and studies that I cited in the brief, demonstrate that. So it is a very unfortunate situation, and I genuinely feel for Afghans, and I think the United States should, accept asylum seekers and refugees, and that's ways we can try to help, and we should use our diplomatic leverage where we can. But this is an indictment on what intervention inevitably leads to. It is not an indictment on what will happen in the immediate aftermath of the US leaving, because that was going to happen no matter what. And it's important to keep the debate honest and not have a revisionist account of what could have been that's not rooted in reality.
Yeah. Immediate term and long term, I think these are the keys. If I were going to make an argument for this, I would say, look, we need to look at the long-term objective. And I would define the long-term objective very, very simply. Afghanistan for Afghans. Getting there will be very difficult, but in the long run, it is what's desirable for all sides. Afghans certainly, for us too. We need to shed very many burdens we have taken upon ourselves. That would be my answer. Are you confident this is going to go through, Adam? Is what we see going to be what we get, as stated this past week? The special forces question. Contractors, otherwise known as mercenaries, resistance from the Pentagon, President Biden's record for peddling, if I may say so, snake oil during a very great deal of his career, right? Are you confident that we're between now and September 11th, this will unfold as planned, as advertised?
Well, I'm somewhat confident, but I think the process is fragile. And this will be a real test of the Biden administration and President Biden's own credibility. He didn't have to go out there and give such a passionate speech and go visit Arlington Cemetery and set a firm date. He could have, given a wish-washy speech and said, well, we're going to leave within a year's time and this and that. But now he has set a firm date, and he has connected this decision to U.S. interests and the benefit of Americans at home. And if he were to reverse that, it would be a real, it would really put his credibility into immense question. That being said, the foreign policy establishment will try their hardest to dilute this as much as possible, whether it means continuing a counterterrorism mission in some form. And now, of course, they're going to have to address the counterterrorism question. There's no doubt about that. But whether it ends up turning back into mission creep is the question we're going to have to ask. I mean, Laurel Miller, who focused on Afghanistan and Pakistan in the State Department, and I believe was the acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. She's at International Crisis Group now, but she wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs a couple months ago that said, you can't disconnect counterterrorism from counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, because if you keep a counterterrorism presence, they're going to get drawn into the counterinsurgency, because who are going to be your partners? The Afghan government, and they will continue to fight the Taliban. And of course, her argument is a bit more complex and nuanced than that. Your viewers can seek out that Foreign Affairs article just by Googling her name in Foreign Affairs. But I think the issue is the foreign policy establishment going to convince Biden to dilute this decision by keeping this sort of CT presence in the country, or by trying to say we need to delay things? I mean, things are going to get rough this summer. And I think what's important for your listeners and for Americans out there is when they open up their New York Times Sunday front page, and they see that the Taliban have taken over a provincial capital, or the rights of Afghans have been downgraded. I think they need to remember that these, terrible, terrible human rights violations under the U.S.-led counterinsurgency have been going on continuously for the last 20 years, and they ebb and flow in the media in terms of whether they get coverage. But it's important not to be tricked or to be, allow a sensationalistic media to make them think that had we stayed militarily involved in Afghanistan, things would be different, or it would be anything other than kicking the can down the road. I think it is important for the American public to remember that you cannot have a counterinsurgency without these sort of side effects. I supported the Australian 2 Commando regiment in Uruzgan province as a Marine. I was a part of a detachment, and it was something called the Special Operations Task Group. Well, some members of that task group are now being investigated for war crimes by the by the Australian government. And it's not just an open investigation. The Australian government has concluded that war crimes occurred.
Very, very distasteful stuff coming out of that.
Very distasteful stuff. And look, I didn't witness anything myself, but at the same time, it doesn't surprise me, because you cannot have an extended counterinsurgency without these things happening. And by the way, that's not me excusing the behavior, but it is important not to go into this with an idealistic, unrealistic mindset that says, oh, well, we can be better next time and we'll have the perfect counterinsurgency. No, in fact, the more opaque, the more elite, the more CT driven the mission becomes, where it's happening in the shadows, the more likely you will get these kinds of human rights abuses, because it's not in the spotlight. And these are the things that come with foreign interventions. And it's important to remember that, and not compartmentalize these things and pretend we are involved in Afghanistan solely to advance human rights.
Yeah. Just quickly, you prompt this question, just a quick answer maybe. I've always wondered, these soldiers behave like this. In the heat of the moment, are they acting out of some fear? Is fear a serious driver? Split-second decision, I have to do something, I feel in danger, or are we breeding a rather objectionable fighting force, right?
Look, I think, again, I didn't witness these things, but I wasn't completely surprised to read about them. I think the vast majority of service members across the coalition and across the branches, and even the types of service, whether it be special operations or not, I think the vast majority behaved ethically. I think the American public should know that the rules of engagement were incredibly strict, and there are US service members who are dead as a result of those strict rules of engagement. And I think most people, I often say this, that this might be something provocative to say, but I frankly think there was more caution, towards engaging the enemy in Afghanistan than there is, afforded to U.S. citizens by too many police departments. Unfortunately, that's the reality, that there was more respect in some cases given to potential combatants in Afghanistan than to the U.S. public. But of course, that's a criticism of U.S. policing culture, not of the fact we had strict rules of engagement. I think it was necessary to have strict rules of engagement in Afghanistan, but we did create a culture where there was this extended war happening that the US or Australian or UK or German public didn't really care about, and you had these soldiers deploying constantly. This was especially true in the special operations community, which, just to be clear, I wasn't a part of, but I served in support of them when I was in Uruzgan province as a Marine, though. And you have these soldiers going on continuous deployments for a war the general public doesn't care about, and they're fighting, in some cases, a bit of a faceless enemy. And you might see how this sort of sanctimonious culture emerges, where they get to decide who lives and dies, and why not kill a prisoner because they're probably a bad guy, and even if they weren't, they've supported a bad guy. This sort of very simplistic good guy bad guy framing, and being off in the shadows, no accountability. This is what always happens with counterinsurgency. So we breed this culture. I wouldn't give them the excuse of fear. I think it's a culture of not being accountable. And if you have enough people deploying, there's going to be people with I'm not a psychologist, but there's going to be people with sociopathic traits. And I think this is what happens.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Adam. What are we talking about when we talk about the Taliban? Who are these people? Are they people with whom one can negotiate with confidence? Do they have a lot of popular support? Well, if we jump to Iran for a moment, we Americans don't like to acknowledge this, but a very considerable proportion of Iranians, not all, by any means, not all, but a very considerable proportion of Iranians support the clergy, the government as it is, the Islamic Republic. Uh, have the Taliban evolved over there? Who are they? Have they evolved from what we had back? I don't know, 20 years ago or more?
I think they've become a little bit more shrewd when it comes to their strategic communications and the way they engage in diplomacy, but they are still a deeply rigid, I'd say even radical, ideologically driven organization that very few outsiders truly understand. In fact, if somebody claims to understand the inner thinking of the Taliban, I'm very skeptical of that. Even people who, speak Pashto and have studied them for
very
a long time.
opaque, very opaque.
Very opaque.
Yeah.
I think, look, the diplomacy between the United States government and the Taliban was limited in scope, and people tried to make it larger than it was. It was a very narrow diplomacy, and it was that we were basically, the Trump administration was basically negotiating a way to leave Afghanistan and not get shot on the way out. And one of the problems, several problems with the US Taliban agreement existed, which I also outlined in the brief, which was that one, most of the things that the United States had to do were very easily verifiable, like withdrawing troops. That's, it either happens or it doesn't happen. But a lot of the things that, responsibilities that were placed on the Taliban as part of the agreement were very subjective, like, don't allow Al-Qaeda and other transnational terrorist groups to carry out attacks on the United States. Well, what does that mean? If you allow them to stay in the country, is that facilitating it?
Yeah.
If you don't break ties with them, is that facilitating it?
You made this point very well in your paper, actually. Yeah.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And then there was a certain ambiguity, and that ambiguity made it easy to get the agreement signed, but it made it very difficult to carry it out. I'll give you one example from the paper is it calls on the Afghan government to release up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners. And of course, the Taliban interpreted that as no less than 5,000 Taliban prisoners, and the Afghan government disagreed. And then this takes us to one of the key liabilities of that agreement, which is that it's an agreement between the Afghan government, between the US government, the US government and the Taliban, that requires actions on the part of the Afghan government as a non-party to the agreement. So
very strange beast.
It's a very strange beast. So this made it a bit dysfunctional from the beginning. But look, people have not emotionally accepted that we lost the war militarily, and that what we were really negotiating was a way out of the country, not necessarily that the Taliban would change and create this new system. We got them to sit down at the table with the Afghan government, but there's a big difference between sitting at the table and compromising and coming up with a new system of government. Yeah. So I don't think the Taliban have changed that much. I think they're still very hard line. But the issue with
popular
Afghanistan,
support.
It's not so much that the Taliban have popular support, then it's more so that the Afghan government lacks legitimacy. I think the majority of Afghans still support the concept of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is like, and they do not support an emirate. When I say Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, I'm referring to the current government. They do not support the return of a Taliban emirate. I think the majority of Afghans support a democratic system that's similar to their current constitution, But they don't support the political elites who have completely mismanaged that system. And in that kind of dynamic, what happens is the Taliban get to have more influence than they otherwise might, because the Taliban has, a demographic of the population that is deeply supportive of them, whereas the Afghan government might have a majority of the population that's lukewarm about the actual people carrying out who are running the government. And so, but again, this takes us back to the problem. The US cannot militarily solve this dynamic. And unfortunately, the Taliban have had incredible resolve on the battlefield, which is an inconvenient fact that people don't like to talk about. And yes, the Taliban have had the benefit of substantial support from Pakistan, and that's an unfortunate reality that the United States has been unable to change. And there is blood on the hands of Pakistani decision makers who chose to continue supporting the Taliban. But that being said, it's a little bit baffling to me that the Afghan security forces have not had more success on the battlefield, given that they had close air support and they had U.S. funding and they had a significant number of soldiers. But there is a concept called resolve, which people don't want to talk about because it's inconvenient. But the Taliban had incredible resolve on the battlefield, and they still do.
We ran into that in Vietnam, did we not? Resolve, right? The arguments against, I think we can now dispose of what we call bounty gate, the assertion that Russians were putting bounties on American soldiers. That seems to have collapsed. But we've now got, it'll be another Vietnam. We've got, this is a striking one for me. Well, we're in South Korea. Why can't we be in Afghanistan the same way? That's a rather scary thought, right? We've yet to come to terms whether we should be in South Korea, right? An orgy of violence, ugly consequences, reckless, dangerous, and a point I put last, by design, the rights of Afghan women. What about these arguments, Adam?
Well, look,
you've addressed some of them already, I acknowledge, but
the Russia bounty gate, the Biden administration has said they haven't seen convincing evidence. Whether it's true or untrue, it misses the point, which is that we're delivering young American men and women to the battle space in order for other regional countries to carry out proxy conflicts that end up with US casualties. The quickest way to solve that situation is not to have US troops in the country. In terms of Vietnam, I know Max Boot made that argument. I mean, I think it's a ridiculous argument. And if folks want to go on record saying that we should have stayed in Vietnam indefinitely, I'll let their argument speak for itself. I don't even think it's serious enough to be addressed.
Well, a good strategy, Adam.
In terms of human rights and women's rights, I think we have to appreciate the way that these rights have been. We have to simultaneously accept that, look, this is a dismal situation, and these are things that sort of troubled me. But we can't allow human rights to be weaponized by proponents of perpetual military intervention. And because they are not genuine defenders of human rights. They didn't care about women's rights for rural Afghans when they were left as widows, because there was in a society where they weren't able to work, because there was a violent counterinsurgency and insurgency going on that was largely driven by the United States. I mean, they didn't care about women's rights in those cases. It's undeniable that women's rights were advanced, as a side effect of this US intervention, especially in large Afghan cities. But the problem with trying to advance rights and development with military intervention is that it creates unsustainable results, where if you engage in genuine diplomacy and genuine aid that's not connected to US security calculations, or at least not in the immediate term, then you can have more sustainable results. What if, we always talk about what ifs in Afghanistan. What if after we disrupted the Al-Qaeda network, and we had invited the Taliban to be part of the Taliban, who were willing to negotiate earlier in the war, had invited them to be part of some sort of political settlement in the very early years of the war. We might not have seen the advances at the same rate that we do now, but what the advances we would have seen would have been sustainable without the permanent presence of US troops, and the advances would have been slow but sustainable, is my point. And that's the hard work of diplomacy and community focused aid versus military intervention that can disrupt things quickly and change things quickly, but then it finds itself unable to create gains that are maintained. I mean, the biggest indictment of the US intervention in Afghanistan, whether from a security perspective, human rights perspective, women's rights perspective, or governance perspective, is that the proponents of this intervention claim that if the US withdraws from Afghanistan, the gains of the last 20 years will be undone overnight. If we remove, depending on the figures you trust, 2,500 to 3,500 US troops, the gains of the last 20 years and $2 trillion spent and thousands of lives lost will be undone overnight. Well, that doesn't sound like military intervention is a very good technique to shape conditions on the ground, does it?
How very, very well stated. I want to stay with this question of Afghan women's rights, because I don't take the argument seriously on its own terms. I just don't, right? There's no consistency. The people arguing for that don't seem to be worried about women's rights here, there, and everywhere elsewhere, right? But I think it's a window onto a very fundamental problem we Americans have, and that is American universalism, right? We're exceptionalists. That's our business. If we want to go walk through our days considering ourselves exceptional, by and large, the problem is our own self-delusion. American universalism is everybody's problem, because we go around the world saying, this is the way we do it, and therefore this is the way you must do it, right? The argument to modernize means to westernize goes back to the 19th century, institutionalized in the 20th century with our so-called modernization theory, right? My thought here, Adam, is until we overcome this problem of universalism as manifested in the question of Afghan women's rights, but manifest multiply all the time, I don't really see that we're going to have a significant turn in US foreign policy. It's a question of method versus purpose, right? We can fool with method. This was Obama's failing. He fussed around with method and never touched the objectives of American foreign policy, right? And until we do, I don't think we're going to have a successful foreign policy. We're going to go from one failure to another. So what about that in your view?
I'd add a couple. I agree with a lot of what you said. I'd add a couple caveats. I mean, I think that most folks, arguing for a continuation of the war in Afghanistan are not super serious about human rights. I do think there's a lot of Afghan women activists inside Afghanistan who are deeply afraid of a U.S. withdrawal, and I understand that fear, and I think that fear is genuine and it's well-founded. And of course, their voices should be heard, but that's not how foreign policy is decided, and it's not how foreign policy should be decided. And that might sound cold to say, but I think anyone
it's not at all cold to say, Adam. It is a little bitter, but Afghan women's rights are to be determined by Afghans.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was maybe I might be incorrect about this, but I think there was a very good Obama era quote. And I agree with your criticism of him that he messed with, he tried to alter method, but he never questioned the pillars of US foreign policy thinking. Yeah. But I think he did have one good quote, which I'm paraphrasing it, but why don't I invade the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a war where 5 million people have been killed? I mean, if it's really about human rights and really about ending human suffering, why don't I invade the DRC? I mean, so the point, and of course, people would roll their eyes at that, but in many ways, continuing the war in Afghanistan is as ridiculous or even more ridiculous of an idea or a proposition. And I think this universalism, American universalism by force is the real problem. I mean, there are certain actors in the world that I'm comfortable saying I don't think, I'm comfortable, I don't think moral relativism should necessarily be applied to them. And maybe the Taliban are one of those groups, but you cannot shape societies, and it should not be the goal to shape societies, especially by force, because it doesn't, I mean, that's just a new, very slightly more sophisticated version of Orientalist thinking, which is that we can change these societies from outside rather than from inside. And I don't, people do forget that, there a lot of people will say, look, Afghan society rejects, or Afghan society has changed, and Afghan society rejects the Taliban. And some of that may be true. Urban Afghan society has changed, and there are plenty of rural Afghans that reject the Taliban as an actor, a violent actor, but they don't necessarily reject the conservatism of the Taliban. I mean, there are huge swaths of Afghanistan that are pretty much on board with the conservative ideals of the Taliban. They just don't like the Taliban. So I think we have to, and look, there's liberal pockets in the urban centers that have genuinely changed, and the society has changed. But again, is America ready to grapple with this kind of complexity? I think not. And so, and then it gets to the point where, if you look at if we want to talk about rights and we want to talk about universal values, look at what is within the control of the United States and yet nobody cares about. Guantanamo Bay is still open. And yet as a society, we have accepted ridiculous legalese logic for why it's impossible to close down this prison, which is a stain on American history, which will be viewed in 100 years as a pathetic chapter in American history. And yet that does not inspire op-eds. That doesn't inspire journalists to tweet. That doesn't inspire people to have these ridiculous moral pronouncements about what we should or should not do. And the examples go on. That's just the first one that comes into mind. And yet, so there's this inclination in American culture to always look abroad so we can avoid looking inward. And I'm not arguing I'm not arguing for isolationism. I'm arguing for starting at home and maintaining the example at home. If somebody truly cares about US influence has been as an inspiration to the rest of the world, not as a military power that intervenes in the rest of the world. And I think we're running low on gas for that inspiration. And I used to travel, I've traveled a lot around the world. I think I've been to over 30 countries, and many of them in the developing world in the last decade. And, I remember early on in the beginning of the Obama presidency, there was still this wistfulness people would get when I said I was from the United States, and they would give you their email address and insist that you could help them find a job or a visa, and people wanted to come. And in recent years, I've seen that change. People want to go to Germany. People want to go to Canada.
Oldsters, Adam, can tell you, and I faintly remember from the 50s, what we meant to the rest of the world after 45. My goodness, have we thrown a very great deal away, Going back to your earlier point, this may sound a touch off the chart, but I think before this century is out, we are going to have to study up on Zhou Enlai's 5 principles. The rest of the world wants to live by them, and we're going to have to learn that if we want to exit our cycle of failures, right? Just 2 more questions. Are we talking primarily here about geopolitical considerations when we think about the September 11th deadline now, or domestic Afghan conditions?
In terms of choosing a deadline that's several months away?
In terms of what really counts as important here, right? What's important to America, domestic Afghan conditions, as we were just discussing, or is the geopolitical game really paramount, whether it's stated or not?
Well, I think for the Biden administration, they cared about geopolitics and CT a lot more than Afghan conditions. There is a relationship. Look, it's without question that if Afghanistan descends into a drawn-out civil war that's much more intense than it is now, that wouldn't be good for security in the region. Of course, that doesn't mean that if the United States stayed, that's a sustainable solution either. I think the Biden administration, what gave the Biden administration pause was partly the optics of the situation, but also partly the prospect of the potential that there could be that, you know, Al Qaeda could gain a foothold, ISIS could gain a foothold, what people always say, and even the small chance of another 9/11 style attack, I think keeps politicians up at night. Of course, that's not a very rational approach to things, but I think there's always been this inclination over the last 3 administrations that, well, things are completely dysfunctional in Afghanistan, but maybe accepting that dysfunction, the sort of devil we know, is better than even than the small chance that there could be another attack that would be very disruptive to US politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think President Trump, I'll say this about him, I'm not a supporter of President Trump, but President Trump was correct in breaking from that conventional logic and engaging directly with the Taliban. And President Biden was brave to continue that forward. And you know, the other thing this does in terms of geopolitics is it frees us up to look at other priorities in South and Central Asia, because everything has been focused on Afghanistan. And it's crazy. If you look at the region, it has, you know, 2 nuclear powers. It's at the front line of climate change. There's border disputes between China and India. Why are we focused almost exclusively on Afghanistan? And, you know, an example of that is that I believe that Pakistan was left out of the, you know, climate summit that the Biden administration is organizing. And I don't know for certain if the reason for that was because they were unhappy with Pakistan's help regarding Afghanistan and didn't think they were doing enough to push the Taliban, or if it was just a matter of not considering the fact that Pakistan should be invited. But that's an example of what this myopic, you know, approach produces. The idea that you would have India at a climate change summit and not Pakistan, when the climate future and the water future of those 2 countries are completely linked. You can't have pollution in Lahore and not have pollution in northern India, and you can't have pollution in northern India and not have pollution in Lahore, and their water sources are linked. And the idea that you would have one at this summit without the other is a perfect example of the way the United States doesn't have its priorities right in the region. And I think, I hope that President Biden, his decision is a first step towards changing that. I'm skeptical. I have deep concerns that this might be a one-off right decision and that we won't see it applied in the future. And what's going to matter is that Americans, whether those in the policy debate or just, you know, readers of the New York Times or the general public, whoever, you know, Americans across who are engaged in this conversation at different levels. And I'm just using the New York Times as a shorthand for people who are engaged in foreign policy, but not part of the policy community, versus people who might not care about foreign policy. But you know, I think they need to hold leaders and thought leaders and journalists and think tankers accountable to concrete policies and concrete steps. It cannot be enough just to say, well, we should really study the lessons of the war in Afghanistan and try to avoid applying them in the future, but in the next sentence say, well, now is the time to increase troop levels in Syria. It cannot be, that cannot be the path forward.
You make eloquent, Adam. Thank you very much. Tell me, final question with another one hanging off of it, I confess, right? Diplomacy, not military intervention. What can we get done with diplomacy in the plenty in the wider scheme of things, but in the Afghan case, what do you mean when you say lead with diplomacy? This is the new phrase in Washington, right? What would it look like? What would we attempt to get done, and could we get it done? Or are we well aimed there or not? Is corollary hanging off of that. What do you think China's going to do after September 11th? Are they? They already seem to be somewhat assertive in the Afghan situation, not militarily, but you know, there's Belt and Road and aid of various sorts. I gather they've got a lot going on the ground there. Diplomacy, and then China, right?
In terms of diplomacy, look, it's difficult for people to accept a diplomacy-centered approach, even though Antony Blinken promised that approach, because it inherent in that approach is an acceptance of the limits of U.S. power projection and ability to shape conditions abroad. Because once you have a diplomacy-focused approach, you have to live in reality and not in the fantasy land of the military interventions of the last 20 years.
Yeah.
We have some leverage with the Taliban. The Taliban want to be removed from the UN sanctions blacklist. The Taliban want more prisoner releases, although that might be difficult now because the Afghan government might not be willing to do that. The Taliban want some form of international legitimacy. They don't want to return to being a pariah state. Whether the Taliban value those things more than they value engaging in violent rampage and trying to have absolute power in Afghanistan remains to be seen. But there is diplomatic leverage that the United States has over the Taliban. It's limited, but it does exist. The United States can, facilitate fora for Afghan dialogue. The United States can lead by example on human rights by, again, accepting refugees and asylum seekers. The United States can continue to provide aid, and Congress can show its foreign policy maturity by continuing to allocate aid to the Afghan security forces, even though there aren't U.S. troops left in the country. And instead of being short-sighted and just saying, well, the U.S. isn't there, so we're not going to do anything about it. The United States, Pakistan is craving a reset in its relations with the United States. It wants to be seen as a geoeconomic partner versus a geopolitical one. And those are their own words. And the United States can use that leverage with Pakistan to try to get it to be a more responsible actor in Afghanistan. The United States can improve relations with Iran so that, I don't know, Iran, one of Afghanistan's most important neighbors, and the United States could work together towards a better Afghan future instead of having to work apart from one against one another. This would be a thing that the United States could do. In terms of China, I would recommend that your listeners check out this book. The Quincy Institute also had if you go to our website and you look at past events, we also had Andrew Small, who is the author of this book. It's called The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. We had him on a panel. That book talks a lot about Afghanistan as well. It has a whole chapter on it about, China's failed mining activities and the way China viewed Afghanistan. China was establishing relations with the Taliban right before 9/11. I think it was, from the Chinese perspective, just, they'll accept who is in power. China still views Afghanistan as a bit of a terrorism threat in Western China. I don't see China intervening militarily. They will be involved diplomatically. But of course, this is another situation. In fact, Daniel Markey just had if your listeners want to Google his name, just had a piece in The Hill about how this is a good example. This is a good opportunity for China and the United States to work together on Afghanistan. I mean, neither China or the United States wants to see transnational terrorist groups operate in Afghanistan. This is a limited off-ramp in relations that are unfortunately becoming more and more tense to work together. But this is the problem with these zero-sum approaches to U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy, which is that sometimes we can't work with a country that shares our interests because we're concerned with applying maximum pressure in some other arena. And so it prevents cooperation. I do think China is important for the future of Afghanistan. So is Iran, so is Pakistan, so is India, so is Russia ultimately, and so are the Central Asian republics. But this will require the United States to be willing to partner with them and in some sense share credit with them.
Thank you, Adam. Very thoughtful commentary. I thank you for it. Something more you want to add, perhaps, or shall we wrap?
The only thing I'd add to today's discussion is, look, I served in Afghanistan. Today, this announcement is not a time for celebration. It's a time for reflection. I think it is an incredible moment for a chance at a new direction in U.S. foreign policy. And for that, I'm in a bit of a celebratory mood, but we have to remember that real Afghans will suffer as a result of this. But I think we need to really, I would implore your listeners to resist revisionist accounts of the war and resist hypotheticals for what could have been if we stayed that are not at all rooted in reality, and be prepared to see, you know, pictures of the Afghan Taliban riding into Afghan cities, but don't allow anyone to tell you that had the United States just stayed longer, it could have been a different outcome, because that's just detached from the historical record.
Sage advice, Adam, and I'm pleased to conclude with that. I thank you very much. Grateful for your time. You've been very generous with it. And on we go. Let's convene again sometime.
Thanks for having me, and I hope to be back again sometime soon.
It'd be great. Thanks very much.